Welcome to the Oncology Voice Network podcast, connecting the voices that move oncology drug development forward.
Welcome to the Oncology Voice Network podcast. I'm Dr. Kirk Shepard. This show brings the real-world voices of oncology drug development to life. Leaders, innovators, patients, and partners who are shaping the future of cancer care. Today, we're exploring a question facing many emerging oncology companies. Can leadership scale as quickly as the science? Breakthrough discoveries and fast-moving pipelines are transforming cancer care, but translating that momentum into a sustainable organization requires the right leadership at the right moment. Our guests today have a unique vantage point on that challenge. Spencer Weneck is a partner at GSS with nearly 20 years of executive search experience in the life sciences, working closely with oncology companies to build leadership across clinical, regulatory, and safety functions. He's joined by Christian Camp, president of GSS, who founded the firm in 2005 and has spent the last 2 decades helping life science organizations scale through the strategic leadership and long-term partnership. I'm excited to speak to our guests, so let's jump right in. Spencer and Christian, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Terrific to be with you, Kirk. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm excited to talk to you today about building strong teams for oncology drug development. Oncology moves quickly and perhaps faster than any other therapeutic area. So let's tackle the main question for today. Can oncology build leadership as fast as it builds science? And so for our first question, over the past few years, what meaningful shifts have you both seen in pharma and biotech in how organizations are built and scaled?
From my vantage, what we've seen are some outside pressures, macroeconomic by and large, that have really impacted the industry. We started to see this in late 22 and really up until present day, where you've seen pressures around capital investment, some clinical holds, general impacts from science hasn't stopped, of course. That continues to roll forward, but the outside pressures have definitely conspired to impact the hiring cycle, the strategy. What we're seeing right now is it's absolutely an employer's marketplace in terms of a bolus of talent sitting on the sidelines or having been displaced by determinants over the last 2.5, 3 years now, in what has been a prolonged cycle, unlike really any we've seen over the last 20 years from where we sit. However, we're starting to see some metrics, some bona fide metrics that are pointing us in a direction we feel like we may have reached a bottom in terms of the scale of employer-based market moving more towards a candidate-based market, at least turning that cycle towards that direction, which we experienced heavily leading up into the pandemic period and even into the first year and a half so post-pandemic. That was a real frenzied period of time from a hiring standpoint.
And I would add to that, I think also very much influencing somewhat of a rebirth in the marketplace is the practical reality that, it is projected that upwards of $300 billion worth of revenue is going to be lost over the course of the next 5 years to loss of exclusivity and patent cliffs. And so what you have as a byproduct is very, very hungry large pharmaceutical companies that need to backfill their pipelines. And that is in turn forcing an increased emphasis on M&A, which is also lifting the markets as they seek innovation through external channels.
Well, how does oncology differ, if at all, from the broader biotech landscape and how companies are thinking about talent today?
Oncology is the market barometer to a large extent. You need to look no further than where the R&D expenditures are across the industry scape to really understand that oncology sets the tone, right? When upwards of 40% of the overall industry's R&D expenditure is going towards oncology, when you look at the reality that oncology accounts for roughly 45% of the pharmaceutical industry's overarching revenue, it all points to the fact that oncology leads the way, and many other organizations, irrespective of therapeutic focus or modality emphasis, really mimic what the oncology market does. And we've seen this now for the better part of, well over a decade, in that when the kind of inordinate emphasis came on oncology R&D, you started to see it creating its own market, right? You saw huge salary, growth that outstripped that of other, disease spaces. You saw tremendous battle for talent, which was necessitating organizations to take creative approaches to trying to hire talent, oftentimes bringing people in at higher levels than would have historically been the case, merited by their experience and credentials. So that has been at play for quite some time, and it is only, I think, kind of enhanced with the passing of time and with the increased investment into the space. So oncology is the market bearer, and everybody follows suit to a large extent.
Yeah, and just to add on to that a bit, oncology has been, if you parse out our work through the therapeutic area pie, the vast majority has been through the years in oncology, and it's been such a hyper competitive space. And as Christian alluded to, within that space, there's almost a different set of rules and tactics from an executive search standpoint. There are hyperinflated compensation scales and unique recruitment tactics that are often utilized exclusively when you're trying to compete for top talent that have the expertise across the solid tumor and hematologic malignancy spectrum. So, and we're often leveraged and engaged by our clients when it comes down to those types of unique, specialized personnel that they have to have, seeking across the world to go and find it. So that's been an area that we have been deeply involved in over the course of our existence, which is over 20 years now.
Let's talk about the evolution of the talent strategy. How has this talent strategy evolved from simply acquiring talent to managing and developing it as a long-term asset?
There's no single point of influence. I think it's multidimensional. All of the market factors that we touched on moments ago that have been particularly poignant in the last handful of years, but also I think very much informed by limited quantity of people with the requisite expertise that organizations need. All of that has really necessitated that organizations think very differently about their talent. And I think it has promoted a much more ready investment in the development of individuals, really with a focus on, garnering them exposure to, broader disciplinary focus, giving them more concentrated management training. All of this really with an eye towards, cultivating talent that can grow with the organization and that can work in a multidimensional manner, as opposed to the very siloed construct of yesteryear, where there were very distinct boundaries that existed in many instances between the representative disciplines, with cutoff points being at entry into man or proof of concept or, registration versus launch. The workforce has become much more fungible, I would say, very much out of necessity, because organizations have needed to get more out of less, and also, make sure that they are kind of future proofing their organizations by developing the skill sets that are translatable and transferable across the stage gates of the development continuum.
And with noted successes that Christian just spoke to, on the flip side, we've seen many a client, we've had a front row seat where the frenzied qualities of the marketplace in oncology, it creates such a hysteria to pursue talent. It's such a competitive landscape, getting, first to inflection points or milestones against competitor assets. And there is much trust on the candidate's CV or the accomplishments, and that's to be lauded, and that's first and foremost. But what can often get lost is around the impact of culture, the race to have those talents deployed, and then there's almost an oversight around how the new colleague, especially from a leadership standpoint, are they really tested in a way that they're bringing an ideology, an approach, a philosophy towards leadership that enmeshes with the company's culture. And we've seen it many a time where that is completely in arrears or opposite. And the impacts are broad. And as a result, we see a lot of churn, a lot of turnover. There'll be successes, but there won't be lasting success in terms of building tenures and long tenures of invested positive impacts. They'll come in, they'll deliver a milestone, the applauds are there, but then the lasting legacy successes are often lost. So there are many case studies to be looked at, and that's one. That's really been an aspect of learning where we try to go very deeply into understanding the individual's motivations, the ideologies, the approaches to leadership, because we're often placing leaders that are impacting the mentorship and development and growth and professional growth of their colleagues. So that's an area that we've seen oftentimes fall by the wayside.
What does future proofing a team actually mean in practice today?
Organizations of all sizes are having to work through. And I think that with the amount of attrition and downsizing that this industry has seen over the last 3 years, it's really forced a lot of organizations, kind of harkening back to my comments of a few moments ago, it placed a lot of enhanced import on their thinking about not only getting the fit right at the outset, but also focusing on identifying individuals who are malleable, who are not dogmatic and fixed in their ways, that are going to ultimately be able to grow and evolve with an organization. And that necessitates, some functional adaptability, right? Being able to kind of move with a portfolio and bring the skill sets that are requisite at various stage gates in a, pipeline's evolution. But that also means, to Spencer's earlier point, really pressure testing leadership capabilities to ensure that individuals are going to be able to not only build cohesive teams, but they're going to be able to, lead those teams effectively through the inevitable ebbs and flows that R&D will present. So again, I think it is really, future proofing is more about focusing on the leadership acumen and the depth of technical conversance as a combination, as opposed to one versus the other, because organizations of the future will need both to succeed.
And Kirk, a lot of our engagement in recent years has swung from a larger pharma, mid-sized pharma clientele towards early stage startup, privately funded venture capital backed groups that are really building de novo. And perhaps it's overly stereotypical, but when we think about future proofing, there's an emerged bias from our hiring partners inside some of these early stage companies that will look at talent coming from larger pharma as perhaps they're too siloed or too ensconced in a well-resourced organization and not having the ability to really broaden and think beyond just the vertical that they're in, but wear multiple hats and deliver in many different aspects. When in actuality, when we engage with those types of targeted candidates who are sitting within larger organizations, that is the carrot, that is the attraction. It is that entrepreneurial element that they wish to broaden and impact across a wider latitude of responsibility. So we see a little bit of a clash there in approach from our hiring managers and smaller companies against candidates that may be coming from a larger pharma. And that's a bias that's emerged there too. So we help our clients to work through that, but it is verified at times as well. And that's what our process is all about, trying to get to the heart of that matter before the investment is made through the exploration process.
So you mentioned earlier stage of development. In designing the right organization, how should companies think about building fit for purpose and right sizing their organizations at the different stages of development?
We've worked with many a company that where we engage initially with the CEO and they're beginning to build their C-suite. And a tactic that we often see is a very strong business development component, an opportunity there to, of course, create revenue streams from a sell side standpoint, but also platform validating opportunities for a new science, partnering opportunities where they can engage with a better established organization with areas of expertise that they may not have, and pursue opportunities with an asset to get regulatory wins and begin building that platform for a potential pipeline within an asset. And then everything begins to sprout and grow. We've seen success stories through that approach many a time.
Organizations are having to be more thoughtful about leveraging external resources. No longer do organizations, I think, have the luxury of simply building large FTE constructs, with capital markets still being a bit lumpy, with enhanced emphasis from an investment thesis standpoint on organizations with mid-stage development assets. Smaller companies at earlier stages with more nascent science really have to be mindful of trying to stretch their funding as far as they can. And so getting a few key leaders as kind of cornerstones for the business to shape the strategy is imperative, but there is an opportunity to utilize external providers, whether that's CROs, whether that's consultants and contractors. Really kind of giving yourself optionality and not over indexing on growing a large FTE base. I think that is the reality of the here and now for organizations of virtually any size, but certainly for the smaller organizations that are trying to validate their scientific hypothesis.
So, are there decisions that matter most early that many leaders often delay or underestimate?
Most organizations, certainly those which are privately held and venture backed, they want to ensure that they have kind of validation at each of the stage gates before they invest further, whether it is in the advancement of the program or in scaling an enterprise. And I think what oftentimes happens, unfortunately, as a byproduct is they don't invest in getting the entire executive team in place, right? They focus on certain aspects that are most germane to the next near-term milestone, but not looking at it through the lenses of, do we have an enterprise that ultimately will be able to support the entire R&D cycle? Because as as a physician, having the right development strategy is paramount, certainly. But if you're not looking at the downstream implications of, once approved, can we get access and reimbursement? What are the life cycle opportunities? What are the capabilities of being able to then apply this validated science into other areas or other assets or other indications? So, it really is imperative, irrespective of where the organization is in the R&D process, that they have a team that has a holistic view of what they're aspiring to build and what the end game is. And we find oftentimes that comes too late in the process because they're trying to stage gate everything.
Yeah, and I would add as well, from a discipline standpoint in organization building, and often I would say we're approached quite frequently as an afterthought in terms of organization building, patient safety and pharmacovigilance. I think that that's a discipline that has grown in strategic importance in the last decade exponentially, but has often been overlooked as contributing towards the bottom line, the ultimate goal and bottom line. Many a client that we've worked with through the years has shared with us that they've used an amalgam of outside resource consultants and the like, where they get to an important point in the development evolution where they need a strategic thought leader internally to work with the R&D leadership team to bring tremendous value, from building a robust safety profile, developing REMS and risk management plans, and really preparing the asset for post-market surveillance. So that is an area strategically that we've seen a lot of emphasis upon with organization building with NewCo, especially ascendant organizations that don't have that function. They've relied on it in an outsourced capacity in more of operational or tactical sense, but the opportunity to upgrade the strategic capability and contribute heavily, if not in the leading sense, to regulatory progression and milestone achievement.
And one last add I would offer there, and I think this is particularly poignant given the substantive increase in advanced modalities, particularly for in the oncology space. When we're talking about ADCs, we're talking about bispecifics or multispecifics, cell therapies, gene therapies. These really highly progressive and advanced technologies are rife with complexity. And oftentimes organizations underestimate the import of getting CMC right early on and building the right CMC infrastructure. Because ultimately, in the end sum, this product, to be successful, it has to be able to be effectively developed and manufactured. And again, with a lot of these advanced technologies, that's where a lot of the bottlenecks start to emerge. So it becomes, really imperative to kind of think about that, the earliest stages possible.
Let's talk a little bit more about bringing in outside people versus being hired or being a consultant. Maybe give us some suggestions about when does bringing in external expertise accelerate progress versus creating fragmentation, loss of the team and the mission.
Once an organization has reached a point where, they have multiple assets in development, it becomes very important to ensure that you have, the right construct of in-house talent. That's when it becomes complex. That's when a lot of decisions have to be made about prioritization and trade-offs, and having a kind of a unified team at that point that is all has a similar North Star kind of obviates a lot of the hangups that oftentimes these organizations find themselves in when they're trying to move everything in parallel. And again, I think we've seen, particularly in an acute sense over the last 3 years, that strategy isn't feasible any longer, right? You can't try to be all things to in R&D any longer. You can't assume that you'll secure consistent capital at the rates that they have in prior years and scale these organizations where you've got a dozen assets in various stages of development across a range of different disease areas. There's just a multitude of horror stories to point to across the industry scape where those organizations have the perceived biotech unicorns, right, that have gone out and raised $1 billion plus in capital and have scaled rapidly, ultimately to find themselves in a position where they have to essentially disassemble the organization just as quickly as they assembled it. So I think when you get to a point where you've got a pipeline versus an asset, it becomes really imperative to make sure that you have a fleshed out organization that's going to carry the burden of the difficult choices that are going to have to be made and the trade-offs that will ultimately present themselves.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Kirk. We as a firm here, we have terrific relationships with some of the world's leading life sciences venture capital firms. And this has been for several years. And we've seen a real shift in their guidance and direction through our interactions where investment, and I'm thinking through the prism of smaller companies here, of course, but investment now is really predicated on clinical data now more than ever. And those points of success lead to further organization build out and the like. And much as Christian spoke to earlier, that fractional executive concept, that cadre of consultant expertise that can be brought in to move programs to key points where they've reached success, and there's that leads to future investment and more organizational growth. So it is about being proper stewards of resource while moving the science forward. It's a fine balance, no doubt. But there is a bit of a playbook now that's emerged that companies are emulating.
Can you share examples without mentioning names where got the organization right and clearly accelerated success?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are some really, poignant examples in the last decade of organizations who have scaled both pipeline and personnel in a thoughtful manner, which has ultimately yielded, I think, significant inflections, right? You see, there are a couple of really notable examples, particularly in the oncology field, where you see, the early pioneers in precision medicine who, built very focused enterprises with very focused science that ultimately, I think, was validated by virtue of large acquisitions, right? You think back on some recent examples, even in the last handful of years. You saw big companies who have gone out and acquired what were seemingly small enterprises with multiple development stage programs for billions of dollars that have then gone on to ultimately lead to multiple approved products. So we've seen it done. I think oncology, as mentioned at the outset, is very much the market leader, and so the successes that we've seen happen in the oncology space are now starting to be replicated and emulated in the other kind of emerging growth areas like immunology, like neuroscience, right? We've seen a couple of examples in the last few years where focused neuroscience companies have subsequently grown quickly and been acquired. The same is holding true now in immunology, where we're seeing kind of a rapid influx in M&A activity. So I think you can really look to big pharma's business development pursuits and where those target acquisitions have come as really good indicators of the organizations that have been thoughtfully scaled, both from a personnel and from a portfolio and science standpoint.
And from an ethos standpoint too, Kirk, I think it bears mentioning we've worked with clients that have centered upon rare and ultra rare oncologic indications and beyond. And it's those companies that really enmesh with their patient community and work closely with patient advocacy groups to know their patients, listen, and the compassion that grows from that. And it just fuels their pursuits. And you can feel that palpably in our discussions with leadership teams, with colleagues within those organizations. They are really aligned in the mission. And I don't want to undercount that because that's so very, very important, that connection there.
And then on the other side of the coin, why do some companies continue to repeat the same mistakes across programs and building their organizations?
The first thing I would point to, and Christian alluded to this earlier, it's trying to do too much at once. Getting on a horse and trying to ride off in five different directions, or trying to build a rapid organization without any framework of a foundation or strategic thought, or even introduction and socializing the idea with the existing organization around how we're going to scale and grow. And then we've seen it countless times when it comes time to organization build, bring in outside talent, clashing with the inside talent because there is not a unified alignment. Communication's been poor. It typically breaks down along those lines from what we've seen.
The catalyst for these misses, ultimately comes back to two things. It comes back to the fact that there is tremendous competition. Companies want to be differentiated. They want to be first in class. They want to be first to market. And all of those rationale push organizations to move quickly, which oftentimes leads to poor decisions. But in the backdrop of all of this is the fact that there is a focus on a return on investment from those who are ultimately injecting capital into these enterprises. Yes, very much to advance innovative science, but ultimately with an end goal of realizing a return on investment. And those downward pressures oftentimes reveal themselves in organizations that are moving too quickly or trying to, as Spencer said, do too many things at once. It's those organizations that have a finite focus and an emphasis on operating flawlessly and expeditiously that ultimately win the day. That's, I think, the kind of the consistent theme that reveals itself time and again.
Let's look at the future and the power of shared learning. If leaders had access to a shared environment like OVN, what we're doing here, where real lessons, failures, and patterns were openly discussed across companies, what would change?
Immediately, my reaction there is the humility to speak about the failings, because that's where we learn most, and sharing of those experiences. We've seen hubris on display many a time with our candidates, with our client organizations, and the like. And to me, that thwarts learning opportunity because where we fall down is where we learn the most. And as we all know in drug development, most programs fail rather than succeed. So studying those and really understanding what contributed to that beyond the science. Was it a misstep in how we built the organization or how we assessed introduction of key leaders into our organization? Did they, as I mentioned earlier, did they fit with our culture? Did they fit with our mission? Were they really in this for the right reasons? We've seen many a mercenary candidate, right? That is just simply focused on climbing the ladder and advancing their career as opposed to really making a difference.
Forums like OVN are immensely important to the ecosystem because I think what it offers is not just a forum for people to share lessons learned, successes and failures, but more so really reminding all parties involved as to what the North Star is. right? Patients are the end objective here, and ultimately delivering, therapies from potentiality to patient impact. And so really continuing to underscore that, I think, brings everybody back to the central theme that is most important, and allows an opportunity for a little bit of a reset, right? With all of the external pressures brought on by the need to deliver investor returns, for the need to create a sustainable enterprise that has a sound base of revenue. Those things are all certainly success factors, but they're not ultimately the end objective. The end objective is to get meaningful therapies to patients to improve their outcomes. And so I think these types of environments really remind all constituents of that core objective, and begins to strip away some of the, as Spencer cited, the hubris and the ego that is often brought on by being in the competitive landscape, right? It's you kind of have to step off the field of play sometimes to remember what exactly is the mission and objective.
Well, Spencer and Christian, thank you for the great discussion today and giving us many insights to build oncology teams to keep up with the fast pace of oncology drug development. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Kirk.
Thank you, Kirk. It's our pleasure.
That's it for this episode. I'm Dr. Kirk Shepard. Thanks for listening and for being a part of the conversation that's moving oncology forward.